Magician horror stories. The rain whispered softly against the cobblestone streets of Pine Haven as Nathaniel King stepped out of the taxi, his worn leather trunk in tow. He paused, the cold drizzle settling into his coat, and gazed at the fog-shrouded town. It wasn't glamorous, nor was it bustling, but it was far enough from his past, from the whispers, the scandals, and the crushing weight of disappointment. With a sigh that felt like it carried the weight of years, he trudged toward the modest inn at the town's center. Pine Haven was a place of quiet charm. Gas lanterns flickered like watchful eyes, and ivy crept up the brick walls of quaint shops and houses. But tonight, under the misty veil of rain, it felt different. Nathaniel whispered to himself, "A fresh start, Nathaniel. Just a fresh start." Yet, deep down, a gnawing unease told him otherwise. The inn's wooden floors creaked under his boots as he climbed the narrow stairs to his room. The space was small, just a bed, a desk, and a single window overlooking the darkened street below. He placed his trunk at the foot of the bed, running his fingers over its familiar surface. He hesitated, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror. His face, once confident, commanding on the stage, looked tired, older than he remembered. "Tomorrow's the show," he muttered. "One last chance to remind the world who I am." But who was he really? The master illusionist who could command a room with a flick of his hand, or the fraud they whispered about when the lights dimmed? Later that evening, unable to sleep, Nathaniel found himself wandering Pine Haven's winding streets. His footsteps echoed faintly as he passed closed shops and dim windows, but something made him stop. It was a small bookstore, its sign reading Ariadne's Antiquities and Curios. The golden lettering glimmered faintly in the lantern light, and through the window, he could see shelves overflowing with books, artifacts, and oddities. He felt an inexplicable pull and pushed open the door. A bell jingled softly, and the air inside was thick. An earthy scent of aged paper mingled with something sharper, almost metallic. "Good evening," a voice said, startling him. Behind the counter stood an older woman with striking green eyes and a silver bun. She regarded him with a calm that bordered on unsettling. "You're the magician," she stated, her tone neither a question nor an accusation. Nathaniel forced a smile. "Word gets around, I suppose." "In a place like this, it always does," she replied, her gaze sharp. "What brings you to Pine Haven, Mr. King?" He hesitated, feeling oddly vulnerable under her scrutiny. "A performance tomorrow, just passing through." The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, though it held no warmth. "Performers like you always find their way here eventually." Before he could respond, she slid a book across the counter. Its cover was plain, save for a strange symbol etched in gold, a triangle encased in a circle. "Take it," she said softly. "Consider it a gift." Back in his room, Nathaniel sat at the desk, staring at the book. His fingers traced the symbol on its cover, his mind racing with questions. When he opened it, he found pages filled with strange symbols and passages in an unfamiliar language. But one phrase stood out, repeating itself like a haunting refrain. "What is seen is never the whole story." He closed the book with a shiver and climbed into bed. Yet sleep, when it came, was restless and full of shadows. The next evening, the community hall buzzed with anticipation. Pine Haven's residents had filled every seat, eager to witness the famous Nathaniel King. The stage, though modest, became his world as he performed tricks that defied logic. The audience gasped and clapped, their amazement filling the hall. Nathaniel felt a flicker of pride. This was where he belonged, commanding the room, bending reality to his will. For his finale, he introduced the illusionist's dilemma. It was his most daring act, one that required a volunteer. A young woman named Jane eagerly stepped forward. Her bright smile and excitement were infectious as she joined him on stage. "This trick," Nathaniel began, his voice steady, "is about trust. It's simple. You'll step into this cabinet and in the blink of an eye reappear across the hall. Jane laughed nervously but nodded, stepping into the ornate cabinet. Nathaniel's hands trembled slightly as he closed the door. "Don't worry," he said, more to himself than to her. "You'll feel nothing at all." The audience watched, breathless as he began. But this time, he added something. A sequence of gestures from the strange book, murmuring the unfamiliar words under his breath. The cabinet trembled. A low hum filled the air. And then, when he opened the door, Jane was gone. The crowd erupted into applause, expecting her reappearance across the hall. But the spot remained empty. Murmurs replaced applause as the seconds dragged on. Nathaniel's heart pounded. He rushed to reopen the cabinet, his mind racing. It was empty. Desperation clawed at him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he stammered, forcing a strained smile. "Just a minor delay. Part of the act." But the audience wasn't convinced. One by one, they left, unease hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Hours later, Nathaniel returned to Ariadne's. The woman was there as if she had been waiting. "You've made a grave mistake," she said before he could speak. "What happened to her?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "You tampered with forces beyond your understanding," she replied, her tone calm but unyielding. "You used the book. Its symbols don't create illusions. They summon." Nathaniel's chest tightened. "How do I fix this?" The woman's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You must face what you've called, but it will demand payment." Back at the hall, Nathaniel lit candles in a circle around the book. His hands shook as he read aloud, the symbols twisting and shifting on the page. The air grew heavy, the shadows deepening. A figure emerged, Jane, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. But behind her a darker presence loomed. Nathaniel's voice cracked. "Let her go." The figure laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the hall. "She is mine. You summoned me. You owe me." Nathaniel stepped forward, his heart hammering. "Take me instead." The figure paused, then nodded. "A fair trade." Jane was found at sunrise, wandering the edge of town, dazed but unharmed. She remembered nothing after stepping into the cabinet. Nathaniel King, however, was never seen again. The hall stood silent, save for the faint scent of candle wax and a single burned circle on the stage. And in Pinehaven, his name became a warning, a tale of the thin line between illusion and reality, and the price of crossing it. This is the Magician horror story number 2. Leah lived in the quiet, unassuming village of Crestwood. Life there was simple, peaceful even. But it was the kind of peace that could feel stagnant. She often found herself yearning for something more. And then, one crisp autumn afternoon, he arrived. Elias Thorne. He wasn't just another traveler passing through. No, Elias carried an air of mystery so palpable it seemed to ripple through the cobblestone streets. His carriage, jet black and intricately carved, rolled into the village square as if gliding on whispers. The villagers gathered, curious and murmuring. And when Elias stepped out, his presence was magnetic. Dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair framing eyes that seemed to pierce right through you, he carried himself with a confidence that bordered on otherworldly. "Good people of Crestwood," he began, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Tomorrow night, I will perform wonders that will defy belief. Join me, and together, we will explore the extraordinary." Leah's heart quickened. She had always been drawn to stories of magic, to the idea that the impossible could be real. She wasn't alone. By nightfall, the entire village was abuzz with anticipation. The next evening, the community hall was packed. Lanterns flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls as Elias took the stage. His performance began simply, a coin appearing from thin air, a bouquet blooming from an empty sleeve. But as the night progressed, the illusions grew more unsettling. Objects floated, defying gravity. His shadow moved independently, as though it had a life of its own. Leah sat at the edge of her seat, both enchanted and unnerved. The crowd gasped and applauded, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. And then Elias unveiled his final act. At the center of the stage stood a cabinet, a towering structure of dark wood inlaid with mirrors that shimmered like trapped starlight. "This," Elias announced, his voice carrying an almost reverent tone, "is the Cabinet of Reflection. Inside lies a doorway to wonders beyond comprehension, but it requires a brave soul to step within." His eyes scanned the crowd, finally settling on Leah. "You," he said, extending a hand. "Will you help me show them the extraordinary?" Leah hesitated. The mirrors seemed to hum softly, as if they were calling her. The audience urged her on, their excitement drowning out her apprehension. With a deep breath, she rose and joined Elias on the stage. "Do not be afraid," he said, his tone soothing yet firm. "Trust me." The cabinet door creaked open, revealing an interior of endless reflections. Leah stepped inside, the world outside fading as the mirrors surrounded her. For a moment, everything was still, too still. Then, the cabinet began to hum, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to sink into her bones. The mirrors shimmered, and Leah's reflection, her countless reflections, smiled back at her. Only, she wasn't smiling. Elias closed the door. The audience watched in breathless silence as he muttered an incantation, his hands moving in deliberate patterns. The cabinet shook, its mirrored surface glowing faintly. When he flung the doors open again, Leah was gone. The crowd erupted into applause, marveling at the spectacle. But as the evening wore on and the villagers began to leave, Leah didn't return. Her friends laughed nervously, assuming it was part of the act, but her family, her brother Samuel especially, felt a growing dread. "She'll be back," Elias said, his smile unwavering. But there was something hollow in his words. By the next morning, Elias and his carriage were gone. The villagers searched the hall, the surrounding woods, and even the riverbanks. But Leah was nowhere to be found. Weeks turned into months, and Crestwood settled into an uneasy acceptance of her disappearance. Yet Samuel couldn't let it go. His sister wasn't the type to vanish, not without a fight. Late one night, lantern in hand, Samuel returned to the hall. The cabinet still stood on the stage, its mirrors dulled but intact. He approached it cautiously, his breath fogging in the cool air. As he ran his hand along the surface, he felt a faint warmth, almost like a heartbeat. And then he saw it, a fleeting image. Leah's face, pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with terror. "Leah?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Desperate, Samuel pried open a hidden compartment beneath the cabinet. Inside, he found scraps of paper, messages scrawled in Leah's handwriting. "I'm trapped," one read. "The mirrors aren't just reflections, they're a doorway. I can see you, but you can't see me. Please, help." Samuel's resolve hardened. The next day, he gathered the villagers, showing them what he had found. Together, they decided to destroy the cabinet, hoping to shatter whatever force held Leah captive. They returned that night with tools and torches. As the first axe struck the wood, a chilling wind swept through the hall, extinguishing their lanterns. "You do not understand," a voice boomed. Elias stepped from the shadows, his face as calm and unreadable as ever. "This cabinet does not imprison, it reveals," he said, his tone heavy with warning. "To destroy it is to destroy her." But Samuel refused to believe him. "You lied to us," he shouted. "You took her." Elias's eyes softened, a flicker of something, regret, crossing his face. She chose to enter. She crossed a threshold that cannot be undone. The villagers ignored him, their determination unwavering. They set the cabinet ablaze. The mirrors cracked and shattered, emitting an unearthly wail that echoed into the night. When the fire died, the cabinet was nothing but ash. Leah did not return. In the months that followed, strange occurrences plagued the village. Mirrors distorted their reflections, whispers emerged from empty rooms, and shadows lingered too long. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, if you looked into a mirror just long enough, you might see Leah's face staring back, her lips moving in silent, desperate pleas. This is the Magician horror story number 3. The autumn air felt cold against Henry Fletcher's skin as he stepped into Cravenford. He had heard the whispers. He'd heard them for weeks, across city blocks and coffee shops, about a haunted place, the Cravenford Theater, and the mystery surrounding it. A troupe that had vanished, without a trace, and Henry, with his ambitions and his hunger for a story, was determined to uncover what happened. The town didn't welcome outsiders. He knew that from the wary looks and clipped answers he received whenever he asked the locals about the theater. But there was one word that stuck: the theater. It wasn't hard to find. Cravenford Theater stood at the end of the street, ancient, towering, its once bright marquee now decaying. It looked forgotten, but Henry wasn't there to admire the building's beauty. No, it was the story, the mystery that called him. He approached the wooden doors, their frame warped with age. When he pushed them open, the eerie groan echoed, as if the building was alive, waiting. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight as he moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The theater, despite its decay, had a presence, like a stage left behind after the final curtain. And then he saw it. A symbol carved into the floor of the stage. A crescent moon surrounded by intricate patterns. His pulse quickened. It was too deliberate, too calculated. What did it mean? He took a breath, trying to steady himself, and just as he was about to step closer, the music began. Software haunting. Faint, almost like it was coming from another room, and yet, it felt like it was right there with him. "Hello?" Henry called out, his voice echoing through the empty theater. The music answered, swelling slightly, pulling him toward the stage. With each step, his heart beat a little faster. His curiosity, a dangerous thing, urged him on. He reached the stage, but his eyes couldn't tear away from the ornate trunk at the center. It was too out of place. Its gold trim gleamed in the darkness, but what struck him most was the same crescent moon symbol that had been etched into the floor. Should I open it? His mind screamed, but his hands already knew what to do. He hesitated, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside were strange items: a cracked mirror, a worn top hat, and an old deck of cards. At first glance, they seemed normal, but as he picked up the cards, a shift occurred. The dust vanished. The air around him became alive, as though he was no longer alone in the theater. The seats filled, not with the empty shells of the past, but with well-dressed people, luxurious gowns and sharp tuxedos. Their faces glowed with excitement. But something was wrong. There was a tension in the air. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The audience's smiles were too wide, their eyes too bright. Henry felt the hairs on his neck stand up. He turned his gaze toward the stage. There they were, the Midnight Troupe, taking their places with an unsettling synchrony. At the center was their leader, Victor Malachi. He radiated power, his gaze sharp and penetrating. And in his hands was the same crystal orb that had been described in the legends. It pulsed with light. Strange, shifting shadows seemed to swirl inside it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor's voice boomed across the room, smooth as silk. "Tonight we shall transcend the ordinary." The audience erupted into applause, but Henry couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't applauding for magic. They were applauding for something darker. And then the show began. Levitation, vanishing acts, feats of mind-bending illusion. Henry's eyes darted between the performers, trying to keep up, trying to see how they were doing it. But each act was mesmerizing, beautiful, terrifying. The crystal orb seemed to absorb the light, its shadows growing deeper and darker with every illusion. Victor raised the orb higher. The shadows inside twisted like a storm, more alive now, pulling the very air with them. The audience roared in approval, but Henry noticed something. Victor's eyes weren't filled with excitement anymore. They were full of desperation. For the grand finale, Victor lifted the orb higher and began chanting in a language that felt like it was scraping at his soul. The shadows thickened. The temperature dropped sharply, and the audience, once so alive with joy, fell silent. Henry's heart thudded loudly as he tried to step back. But the shadows were faster. They were already creeping toward the front rows, wrapping around the legs of the seats, swallowing everything in their path. The crowd screamed. The performers tried to flee. But it was no use. The shadows overtook them, swallowing them whole. And then, in a blink, it was over. The stage was empty. The theater was empty. The audience, gone. The performers, gone. Henry stood frozen in the decayed space, his breath catching in his throat. He glanced at the cards in his hands. They trembled. He wasn't alone anymore. A faint whisper echoed from the cracks in the walls, in the very air. "Help us." Henry spun toward the sound. The cracked mirror inside the trunk glinted in the dim light, and as he peered closer, Victor's face appeared. "You saw it." Victor's voice was hollow, his eyes pleading. "The price of pushing too far." Henry's voice faltered. "What happened here? Why did it end like this?" Victor's face darkened. "The magic. It was too much. I thought I could control it. I wanted to control it. But the orb, it takes everything." Victor's voice dropped to a whisper. "The audience, my troupe, all of them, trapped." Henry's stomach turned. "Trapped?" Victor's eyes flickered. "And now, so are you." Suddenly, the mirror shattered in his hands, the pieces vanishing before they could hit the floor. The air in the theater grew thick. The shadows, once bound to the orb, now began to stir again. They crept across the stage, inching closer, reaching toward Henry. His breath caught in his chest as he turned and fled. The theater, alive now with shadows, seemed to stretch on forever. The walls bent. The exits slipped away. Desperately, he pushed through the doors and stumbled into the night air, gasping for breath. The theater loomed behind him, silent. But the shadows were still there, seeping through the cracks, stretching beyond the building. It wasn't over. It wouldn't be. Not until someone stopped the orb, destroyed it once and for all. But Henry knew the price. He knew what he had seen, what he had felt. He could turn away. Walk away from Cravenford. Let the darkness stay hidden in the theater. But as he stood there, looking at the pale crescent moon in the sky, he knew something worse than the shadows was already on the move. And the story that had pulled him in had changed him. Because there was no escaping what the orb had awakened.